Ladies and gentlemen, we'd like to begin the afternoon session.
午後の部の最初は
The first speaker, I would like to introduce Dr. Daniel Kammen of the University of California, Berkeley. Nuclear energy, wind power, to photovoltaic power, he covers a wide range of energy sources. ICCP that has won the Nobel Peace Prize in 2007. He was also a member. And also the Discovery Channel that we know of. He has also served as navigator for an energy-related program. And therefore, he has committed himself to the furtherment of energy-related endeavors. And he will talk about energy diversification in the United States. He will offer some insight about the cutting edge in this field in the United States. Well then, Dr. Daniel Kammen.
Daniel Kammen. Hey, thank you.
Well, thank you all very much for the chance to be here today. I wish that I could give this in Japanese, and I appreciate that you will tolerate the talk in English. I hope to cover several things today, and the most important one I can say right in the beginning, so there's no need for the talk. The most important feature in my work on energy is that we do not have enough research groups and teams of faculty, students, industry, and government working together not on specific technologies, but on the whole system. And I will come back to that many times during my comments, but that really is the place where we lack the most coherent vision, whether it's the smart grid, whether it's the integration of small energy systems for villages, rural towns in Japan or United States or Indonesia. We need much more expertise around the system. And unfortunately, for academics, studying these types of systems for a long time was seen as applied research, which to many researchers wasn't worthy of study. It wasn't likely to produce a Nobel Prize. And this is a huge mistake. We have to think much more about how to study the full systems perspective to understand the opportunities. So I will try to highlight many of the places to do that in my comments today. And all of the material that I will describe today is available on the website of the laboratory. So I run both a transportation laboratory and also this renewable energy lab. And we pride ourselves that the websites are quite complete. You can find the research papers, testimonies to Congress, my work last year at the World Bank when I was Director of Renewable Energy and Energy Efficiency, video clips. We try to put all of the material in one place. So please feel free to go to the sites if you want more on anything we're talking about. Again, I highlighted in the beginning that our laboratory is mainly focused on understanding the whole system. We have some projects in individual technologies or policies, but the main goal is to integrate. Our lab also works equally in developed countries and in developing nations. And I will start my comments today looking at the energy mix in California and the United States, but I will, depending how much time we have, also talk about Indonesia and Malaysia and East Africa and Central America and rural Northwest China, where we're also working on some projects. So I'll try to get to those as well. In many ways, technologies are the first part of the conversation. Working on basic science for new solar cells or fuel cells is considered exciting basic science, and it's easiest to get researchers involved in those kinds of areas. So one thing for all of the very rich billionaires in the audience is to think about giving out prizes and awards for work about the system. We don't have many of those, only a few. I will start with a few examples of technologies because they do provide a critical part of the story. But technologies only work and are only as useful as we embed them, as we include them in a larger system. And I will try to illustrate that point throughout the talk. And my last point that we'll come back to in some discussions later in the conference is about some of the ways to build collaborations. So one of my students, Frank Ling, is here, who has made many of these linkages, is working not only at a research institute in Japan, but also at a university in training and in working on this broad area of sustainability science. And I've met some colleagues just today, also working on what should go into sustainability science, what are the disciplines you need to know to get there, and what is the interdisciplinary, what is the broad way to look across areas? Not just an engineer who learns a lesson from a sociologist, but a real dialogue between the two. And it's very easy to say we should do this, but it's much harder to do it in practice. And so I will try to illustrate that as I go. But let me be somewhat faithful to what I was asked to talk about today, and I will begin my comments with looking at what is the status today and what is changing in the mix of energy resources used in the United States. And unfortunately, we have not been as successful as we should be, not only in the last decades, but we've not been as successful as we should be in just the last few years under the current administration, which very much wants to be a leader in bringing the United States to a much greener energy mix, but has had a true, very hard set of battles, political within the parties in Washington, D.C. It has not been as successful as any of us had hoped. So some of the things I will talk about are yet to be, but at least in my home state of California, we are seeing some remarkable successes. So let me spend one or two slides just to orient where we are. When President Obama came into office, the United States already had a very interesting situation. We did not have, and we do not today, have a national clean energy mandate, but all of the states marked in red here have their own individual clean electricity targets. Unlike in Europe, where the feed-in tariff is the most popular mechanism, in the United States, we have what are called Renewable Portfolio Standards, RPS, that are state-by-state mandates for a certain level of renewable energy. Rhode Island, a small state, 16% of electricity from renewables by 2020. California, 20% of electricity from renewables by 2010. California did not quite achieve that standard. California was about 17% from renewables by 2010. But already our current governor, Governor Brown, and just to show you that in California we understand recycling, we have recycled a governor. He was governor 30 years ago, and now he's back as governor again. So at least we can recycle governors. He signed a package to make 33% of electricity from renewables by 2020. Often New York and California compete, and New York has a target of 24% of energy from renewables by 2013. And this is where the states vary, and it matters quite a bit. In California, 33% from renewables means from biomass, geothermal, solar, and wind, and small-scale hydro. Large dams do not count. In New York, their standard includes large hydro in the 24%. So the differences matter quite significantly. In fact, in California, the renewables fall under the Renewable Portfolio Standard. Nuclear and large hydro are separate categories. So building those technologies doesn't count towards our renewable energy standard. California's plan has a feature which Japan is much better at than we are. But in this area, California, I think, is setting a very important example. California has been innovating in clean energy for over 40 years. And while we are not as efficient per person as you are in Japan, the average California resident uses 40% less electricity than the national average in the United States. And for one state to be that different from the nation is quite dramatic. In fact, California is not the only one. Wisconsin, New York, Rhode Island, along with California, are all very efficient per person. California has a global warming plan that says instead of continuing to grow our emissions, the black is history, the gray is a forecast, and California's law says we must reduce our emissions by 25% over the next 8 years, under a decade now, to get back to the 1990 baseline. That's the IPCC starting ground. That is already very aggressive, and in fact, California has a more aggressive plan to go further than that. So what I've listed here are a set of these different standards that all work together in California to create a low-carbon economy. This is, if you will, the political science of system science. This isn't the smart grid or smart appliances or meters. This is a policy environment that links together. In the 1970s, California began a process to push energy efficiency year after year. And in 1980 to 1982, California instituted a policy that few utilities have supported, but California was able to force it through, and in the places that have done it, it has had a huge effect. It has not been easy anywhere to get utilities to consider this next method. It's called decoupling, and decoupling has a very powerful effect. What decoupling means is that a utility and the regulator estimate what will be the total sales of electricity for next year or the year after. And then, once the regulator agrees on the amount, let's say 1 billion kilowatt hours is the estimated sales for next year, then the regulator guarantees the utility will make that much money, 1 billion kilowatt hours times the price. And the regulator says you will make that much money if you sell more than 1 billion kilowatt hours. You'll still get the same amount of money, but we'll pay you less per kilowatt hour. If you sell less kilowatt hours because you support efficiency, you'll be paid more per kilowatt hour so that your revenue is the same. And the value of this program can transform a utility, because if you sell more kilowatt hours a year than your target, you get paid less, but you have to buy the fuel. If you find ways to help households and businesses and industry to be more efficient, you get the same revenue, but you don't have to buy the fuel. This is a way to turn the financial equation so that utilities become leaders in efficiency. In California, all of the utilities operating under decoupling now pay people to plant trees to block the sunny side of their home, because they've done the math and they calculate that the saved energy is worth it in terms of planting trees. Again, this has never been easy, and sitting down with utility CEOs has been difficult on this topic. But if I were to recommend one policy tool as Japan thinks about the new energy economy post-Fukushima Daiichi accident and disaster, that would be a tool that, while very challenging, has huge opportunities. California also has a loading order, which means that if you want to build another power plant, you must demonstrate to the regulator you've looked at energy efficiency and then renewables before you're even allowed to consider a gas-fired plant. You're not allowed to build coal in California, and you're not allowed to build nuclear in California as of today. California also has a low-carbon fuel standard that means that we must make our fuels for our cars cleaner each year, just like the renewable portfolio standard works for electricity. All of these things work together to establish a very interesting low-carbon plan. One aspect of California's plan is to say that every new home built after 2020 must generate as much energy as it consumes. Net zero energy homes. And we know how to do that today. There are companies in Japan, in the United States, and Europe that build zero energy homes. It's state law. It is not a stretch. It will require change on the part of the construction industry, but it's not a revolution. California also requires, by 2030, that all office buildings are also net zero energy. And we do not know how to do that today. This one sets a new target for California, and we're working fast to find out how to do it, but we physically cannot do it as of this point. So we set some goals that we can achieve and some goals that will push industry. An example of finding opportunity is a building that I hope many of you have been to. I know the mayor of San Francisco hopes you will all visit. And this is the conference center in San Francisco, the Moscone Center. Any of you who go to the American Geophysical or the meetings have been to this building. And it has a large 600 kilowatt solar array on the rooftop. The city owns the building, and the city used savings from energy efficiency to finance the solar. And the city then used rebates on solar to build more efficiency. So here's an opportunity where more efficiency and more renewable energy each help to finance each other. And they worked very closely to make this one of the most efficient conference centers in the world. I promised I would say a few minutes about interesting, exciting technologies. We sometimes say sexy aspects of the story. I will highlight two examples because they show the role for innovation in technology and information systems, and they do help dramatically to change the options. But as I said, I'm more focused myself on the overall system. So I'll highlight the story of a smart home, and we heard the keynote before lunch highlighting many of these issues. Let me tell a very short story about a dumb way and a smart way to install solar. Today, almost every homeowner or business that has solar on the roof has solar panels connected together, this is for the electrical engineers in the audience, in series, where the DC output of an array of solar panels is summed. Why do we do that? We do that today actually because we're either stupid or because we're slow to change. That's not why we do it for real. The real reason why we do it is because when we started to install solar, the panels were expensive, but so is the inverter, the device that makes the direct current into alternating current. And if both the solar panel and the inverter is expensive, it makes sense to minimize the total investment. Well, I suspect everyone here has a cell phone, and the hardware in your cell phone allows you to create AC power from DC very cheaply with very low losses. So one natural thing to do is to disconnect this series circuit, because a series circuit means that if this panel is blocked by shade or is dirty or has bird poop on it, that reduces the output of the whole system. So that is a very silly way to connect expensive solar panels together. Instead, you can hook it so each solar panel produces AC power directly, and now that AC power is simply summed and used in the home or sent to the grid. It turns out, because of the cost reductions in the hardware in your phones, that this new technology, micro-inverters, can cost the same or less for small solar home systems of a kilowatt or two to larger systems. And here are two examples. Here is a roof with a small amount of tree shading. During the day, this solar array gets 10% more power out for the same price with microinverters. And here's a system where it's heavily shaded and the energy benefit is huge, a third more power out. On average, we find that between 5 and 20% additional power comes out of solar systems, whether they're very small household or large grid systems, when they're connected in this way. And again, this is a very obvious innovation when you look back on it. So a question to ask is, why didn't we make this change sooner? Still, most solar installed uses traditional inverters. Well, the story in this case is that two entrepreneurs from the information world, they both worked for the Bell Labs Corporation and then came to business school at Berkeley, came into my office one day and said, "We know you work on solar, but why do you connect it in such a dumb system?" And they said, "We don't have any knowledge about energy, but we see that this doesn't make sense in terms of an information telecommunications perspective." They spent the time working on these microinverters, and now their next product is partnering with several of the largest solar companies, so the solar panels you buy have the microinverter on the back, and they are AC modules that you can simply click together one after another. So it is a clear systems upgrade, but it's also one that's interdisciplinary. It ties together innovations from the information technology world and energy systems to make a better product. Again, that's the kind of technical innovation that can change how we think about energy systems. Here's another example. A student came to me on her first day on campus a few years ago, and she said, "If you want someone to buy a car, what's the most important thing?" And I started to think about a long, complicated answer. And she said, "The most important thing I happen to know is to do a test drive. If you want someone to buy your car, they need to drive one." What's the problem with getting the public interested in electric vehicles? It's very hard to go find one to test drive in many places. So she said, "I have an app for that." And what she meant was, drive around in your regular car, but have your smartphone record your position and acceleration, take that data, and utilize it to simulate what would be your driving bill, what would be the cost, would you run out of power if you were driving an electric vehicle. So she built the application for the smartphone. We found someone to finance it. We started a small company. And now, here's an example. So here's a drive from my laboratory in Berkeley down to the office of the group that funded us. That's our most important drive. So that's where the money is, that's where we are. If you drive in your regular car, my vehicle, you drive all the way in using gasoline, petroleum. If instead you make that drive in a Chevy Volt, perhaps you get this far on electricity and then you convert. If instead you drive the Nissan Leaf, perhaps you get the whole way. If you drive a Prius hybrid vehicle, maybe you get the whole way as well. So what this allows you to do is, without having to go to the dealer to wait in line to drive an electric vehicle, to get a feeling for what is the range, what's the performance. And in fact, when we see surveys of potential buyers of electric vehicles in Germany, the UK, Norway, and Denmark, and the United States, the single biggest worry is not the cost, because early adopters will often pay more. But they're worried that they will drive and they will run out of power on their normal day's drive. So here's a way to do your actual drive and to learn about the range. Of course, this opens a whole information technology question, which is complicated. Because if we know where the vehicle is all the time, we can often learn things about people's driving habits that maybe we shouldn't know. So to illustrate this point, we installed the first one of these devices in the car of my student's mother. And she observed her mom's driving habits, and she said, oh, this isn't so good. Some days my mom drives from here to here, and she stops at the park and goes for a walk or does Tai Chi. That's good. Other days, she buys McDonald's. And so what my student did, just to illustrate the power of this, was whenever her mom's car stops at a fast food restaurant, her mom receives a text message that goes, "Boo." Whenever she stops at the park, she gets a hand clapping. So there are information parts of the story that we have to learn about. But I bring this up in terms of thinking about the information technologies and the energy systems that can change our system. Let me move now into what I really want to talk about, and that is the systems planning. And I will bring this back to discuss some of the energy choices that Japan is now thinking about as well. When most of us build forecasting models about the energy system, we tend to build graphs like this that show the amount of energy from different sources, maybe with no nuclear, maybe with lots of efficiency and renewables. But we don't build dynamic models very often. Some utilities have very detailed models of the whole system, but many utilities today actually have models which are not of the entire grid. And one of the challenges for all of us working on this topic is the models we need to think about the smart grid are very detailed. They require us to know the precise status of the transmission lines. Are they heating? What's the load on them? Are there local spots where there's a large amount of demand from perhaps everyone charging up their electric vehicle? We need a much more detailed picture of the system. And I was foolish enough to think that I should build such a model. And I only say this foolish because I did this as a physicist, not knowing how detailed it has to be. In fact, if I'd asked my friends in electrical engineering, I never would have started. Because the level of detail that you need often means that to plan a system that's low carbon and robust and low cost, you need a huge amount of data. In fact, the model that I will describe in this paper, which if you go to the University of California, Berkeley's website, there's a press release because this paper was released today. This is a model that forecasts energy cost and demand until 2030 and it takes time steps of less than an hour all the way until then. It's incredibly detailed. It's not a model of California. It's a model of Western North America, including British Columbia and Alberta and Western Mexico, because the whole system operates as one large system. It's the Western Electricity Coordinating Council, the WECC. In this model, we take these time steps. We receive detailed data on the status of every transmission line from the national regulator, the Federal Energy Regulatory Commission. We utilize that information to construct a linear program, a cost minimization model, and then we add in robustness and reliability, a price on carbon, constraints due to water, changes in water level due to global warming. We build all those in as constraints. And what we find is pictures of the supply we need. In this case, purple is nuclear, red is geothermal, green is biomass, yellow is solar, light blue is wind, dark blue is hydro, gray is gas. And this is 2 days a month over a course of a year at the end year of this model at a very high price of carbon, $70 per ton of carbon dioxide. We run lots of these scenarios, and the paper we released today comes to the following conclusion. And perhaps no model was needed to come to this conclusion. And that is that if we start today, sorry, I apologize, these are a little bit messed up. These are the same numbers, $0 to $100 a ton of carbon, and the total generation. And this point here, in the year 2029, is getting to 450 parts per million. So this is an aggressive climate goal. And what we see, of course, is that as the price of carbon rises, the amount of coal we use drops dramatically. The amount of gas increases at first, but as the price of carbon goes up, the amount of gas finally gets to start being reduced, and the amount of solar and wind would need to rise quite dramatically. Now, I don't think we needed a very complicated model we run on a supercomputer to come to this result. What is important when we look at the mix, gray is gas, blue is hydro, yellow is solar, red is geothermal, light blue is wind, we see that examining the state of the system is critical. Now, I've only shown the main flows of power. What I haven't shown is the actual transmission lines, but we look at the voltage across each line. It's a very large calculation. The most interesting result in terms of thinking about Japan's future is that what we see is quite interesting. These are a number of different scenarios. The one I just showed you we call the base case is this picture here. But we also look at cases when nuclear power is low cost, $4 a watt. We look at cases when gas is inexpensive or gas is expensive, when solar is reasonably costly or is expensive. And what we see for the West is that for a range of prices of carbon between a low of $59 a ton and a high of $84 a ton, that we have scenarios that can meet the energy needs of the West and do so while meeting that very strong carbon target of reduced emissions. But what's most interesting is that the price of electricity doesn't change very much. What we find is that from today's current prices in California, in the West, the price of electricity over 20 years would only need to rise about 20%. So that all of these different scenarios, quite different in the technologies, can all get there. They can all meet aggressive carbon targets. The reason why the price of power doesn't go up very much is because we are substituting, we're adding a price on carbon that redistributes the supply, and in fact means that the technologies that are becoming less expensive today, onshore and offshore wind and solar, extensive use of biomass, increased use of geothermal energy, all play a significant role. In fact, nuclear plays quite a small part of the cases we've looked at, because one rule we did not relax in this model was we did not change the current rule, and that is it's illegal to build new nuclear in California today. California has 2 operating nuclear power plants. They both retire just about 2030, and we don't bring new plants on in this model in California. A few others are built in the West, but not even enough to replace the current supply. It's not a nuclear intensive set of scenarios. And again, the actual scenario for the US West doesn't have a direct impact on the planning in Japan, but the fact that over a wide range of technology options, we find it possible to get to very low carbon targets, much ahead of the current planning through the climate convention discussions. That says something very important about the opportunity at the systems level to meet different targets. The critical part of the story, though, is to manage the system. If we have, in the US West, the ability to build power plants, but not the ability to build and upgrade transmission lines, we cannot get there. If we can build transmission, but cannot build the generation we need, we can't get there. A model like this assumes that we have coordinated planning that allows us to work back and forth between the generation we need, the aggressive use of efficiency, and the transmission and distribution systems we need. Now, in the United States, we are not good at managing the transmission process. Building new transmission lines is very costly, very expensive, and very long process in the court system. So it is a lesson for our leadership for what we have to do. In fact, the problems of building transmission in the United States have made offshore wind even more attractive, because you can place it offshore, and even though it's more expensive, bring transmission relatively easily to the urban areas on the coasts. So this highlights some of the opportunities we have to move things ahead. Now, a framework to think about energy choices that has become very popular is one that was developed initially by the Swedish utility Vattenfall, and then worked on extensively by the McKinsey Group. And it's a picture that I hope many of you have seen. It is a very imperfect picture, but it contains a lot of interesting information. And what's plotted here, and I hope, again, many of you have seen this, is what would be the likely cost, either a cost you must pay or savings you can gain by investing in different technologies. That's on the vertical axis. On the x-axis is the size of the estimated opportunity. So we see right here, nuclear has a cost, but quite significant, several gigatons worth of abatement. This is an analysis that the McKinsey Group did for the whole world, which is a bit broad. But it highlights the range of negative cost options through investing in efficiency, through making vehicles better, roads better, houses, buildings better, and then technologies that we will need to reach our carbon target. And in fact, this total, roughly 36 to 38 billion tons of carbon mitigation, will be needed to reach carbon targets by the same year I've been describing, by 2030. This is the global level. Oops, they're out of, sorry, the 2 are out of order. I'll skip back. Okay. And I will come back in a few minutes to describe this same kind of analysis, not only at the global level, but at the national level and then the village level. And I highlight this because I said in the end of the talk, I wanted to talk a little bit about the developing country aspects of the story. One of the things that is the most worrying to me is that if we look today at the number of people without electricity, it's about 1.5 billion people. And if we look at the International Energy Agency's forecast, the circles on the left are the fraction without electricity today. The rural area is purple, and the small blue is urban. We see that while in Latin America and in Asia, there is a reduction in the number of people who don't have electricity, in Africa, the number increases. In fact, on a global level, the forecast is that over the next 20 years, the number of people who will be living without electricity won't change very much. That means that the work we're doing at international agencies like the World Bank, Asian Development Bank, national development issues in Japan, the United States, and Europe are not having anywhere near enough effect. That means we're not innovating and deploying anywhere near enough to reduce energy poverty. And energy poverty is bad for national development, it is bad for people's livelihoods, it's bad for national economies. So one area where we critically need progress is on this area. UN Secretary General Ban Ki-moon has announced that 2012 will be the year of universal energy access, and has appointed a high-level commission that I'm pleased to serve on with the goals of developing plans working specifically with industry and with governments from towns to cities to nations that can contribute to finding ways to doubling the rate of improvement in energy efficiency, doubling the fraction of energy that comes from renewables, and doing so that nations or regions that do this can learn from each other. So we have been active in this area for a while, and in fact, an example campaign is one that we worked on in Sabah, in Malaysia, over the past 2 years. What we were asked to do by a set of community groups in Sabah, based in Kota Kinabalu, was to examine a proposed plan for a new 300 megawatt coal plant that would be the first coal plant in Sabah, and to find out if there were opportunities to replace it with another plant. We did the analysis. We found that by using the waste from the palm oil industry, small run-of-the-river hydro, and geothermal and efficiency, that it would in fact be relatively straightforward to meet that 300 megawatt needed supply without the coal plant. The Prime Minister of Malaysia received our plan, agreed to it, and announced that in a mixture of natural gas and the renewables we're talking about, that they would abandon the coal plan. And in fact, it was an interesting example of technical analysis at the whole systems level that was then presented and made available to the Prime Minister and his team. And in fact, the offer that the set of non-governmental organizations made was, if you adopt this plan, we will work with you on the solutions. And that has taken place. This group called Green Surf has been working with palm oil plantations to find some of the most sustainable ways to manage the palm oil that's in place, while at the same time trying to limit further expansion of palm oil. So it's an example of the systems level process. Another one, a technological point that has opened some doors, is the following. This is a program called Lighting Africa that we have some people in the audience working on here. Lighting Africa has a very interesting history. Because of the problem of so many people without electricity, a number of proposals came forward to make very small amounts of energy available. This is a very small solar panel with a very, very small efficient LED light. And when these devices were first described, the initial reaction was, this is a bad idea. It's a bad idea because this is such a small amount of energy, such a small amount of light, that this technology will make people only feel they're getting an inferior good. They're not getting full house energy. They're getting a little bit. In fact, we have seen the reverse. Because lighting services are so important, we've seen programs that are private sector growing to bring these technologies to countries across Africa. And interestingly enough, one of the things that made this process go even faster was something I'm showing in these small bags here and here. I suspect you can tell what those are. Those are the adapters to plug in your cell phone and charge it off of this small system as well. Because if you live in a rural area and don't have access to electricity, that small amount of energy to power your cell phone has a very high value. In fact, in a number of countries where Lighting Africa is in operation, when these small sets of adapters for cell phones costing roughly $1 were added, the sales dramatically increased. Now we're seeing United States Department of Energy, the World Bank's International Finance Corporation, and the main part of the World Bank, and other partners finding ways to expand this program, where only 5 years ago, without any field data, they were saying consistently, this is not a good plan. So here's an example of applied work in the field, opening the door, and now we have research laboratories at my university, Berkeley, at MIT, ETH in Switzerland, and others, looking for contracts to find what other high-value, low-energy demand services can they add. And the next rollout will be for a small radio as part of this package. So this highlights some of the things that we think in theory do not make sense, require a much more field and applied research program to figure out what is really useful and what is not. And it highlights an important aspect that the energy field doesn't have a lot of theory. Many of us come to energy from fields like physics, where there's a lot of theory, or electrical engineering, but learning about the applied side of energy, or the behavioral side, is something we all need to do to become much better versed at understanding the system. So I mentioned before these global assessments. The World Bank, while I was there, worked with the governments in India, Mexico, Nigeria, Brazil, and Poland to develop national-level low-carbon plans. This is one of the low-carbon curves for Poland. And a student of mine and I, 2 years ago, worked with a very small rural community in Nicaragua to do a same story for a rural fishing community. And what's interesting about the curve here for this small village, this paper appeared in Science in 2010, is that while these curves are both for what could happen in 2030, this community in Nicaragua of 2,000 people conducted the analysis, obtained a grant from their Ministry of Energy, completed all of these projects in 24 months. So everything you see here is done as of today. And the deal that they set up was there was one industry in town. It was a plant that made ice, so they could pack lobster for shipping to Miami and to Europe. And the deal the community group gave to the one industry was, if we assist you in becoming more efficient, will you allow us to use the energy that you were previously burning in your diesel generator to power the community? The company accepted. The community group received compact fluorescent lights and meters from the utility. They installed them. Initially, the company kept generating the amount of power before, but they built a mini-grid. And now with the addition of bioenergy, small wind, and solar, they've actually reduced the size of their generator. In fact, one of the blocks of savings on here is they were able to reduce the size of their diesel generator. So they saved on their fuel bill, they electrified the community around them, and they have gone carbon neutral in a small rural community. And this highlights maybe my last point, and that is that we think consistently about energy efficiency as Japan is a leader, as California is, as Denmark is, as a critical resource for the wealthy. But in fact, the poor pay a much larger fraction of their income for energy. So finding ways to bring energy services through renewable energy, through efficiency to the poor, can transform that equation. I'll close with a comment on the tools that are available. One of the aspects of the story that has proven particularly valuable is something that Governor Schwarzenegger asked me to do several years ago, and that was to build a series of web tools that allow individuals, small industry, and cities to evaluate their carbon footprint, their water footprint. And so we have built a series of these tools. This is one of the websites for the state of California, called coolcalifornia.org. And you can see there are calculators for people, businesses, and for governments. And by running through this, you not only do a carbon inventory, but it also provides you with data on technologies or options that you have not done that would save you carbon or money or both. In fact, this is an example page that shows things the person didn't do. Buy a more efficient car, what you would save annually and in carbon. And we have found that simply having this website available, and we've built versions for California, for several cities in Colorado, for Sabah, for the Virgin Islands, and we are currently building one for the nation of Kosovo, have been particularly valuable in having them the opportunity to assess what the impacts would be, and then to ask us, can you tailor this website because our community is very dependent on coal or has a lot of tourism? And so we've worked with a number of communities to build versions of these calculators that allow this information-based assessment of the energy options to become part of what they do. So I want to close with that because it's much more of an offer and an opportunity to collaborate at the level of smart grid programs, at the level of energy and carbon analysis for communities. But in each case, what I've tried to highlight is the degree to which it must be the system that you look at if you want to truly find all the options. There's lots of exciting technologies, and I'm very excited about the ones I showed you here, but they only really make a difference in terms of sustainability science if we find ways to integrate them together. So thank you very much for your attention.